Yeah, but Brian, okay, but if you asked AOC, for example, what is a woman, we all know she'd struggle to answer, right? This is the problem, right? She would be very, very wary of articulating that a woman is an adult female, right? Because
I think
AOC
would have no problem. I think people love creating.
She would struggle.
Correct.
Okay, how about Mamdani then? Mamdani tweeted out
the only struggle would be arriving at a common point of definition between her and transphobic people who refuse to accept trans people as people and trans women as women and trans men as men.
Yeah, but this is where, but hang on, Mark, this is where you're so wrong, and I'll explain why. You know, Kamala Harris, if you remember in the last election, in the run-up to the election day, the most successful ad in modern American political history, the New York Times said afterwards, was the 30-second ad about Kamala Harris and the trans issues, ending with Kamala's for they, them, Donald Trump is few. They reckon it moved the needle by 3 points. And yet at the same time, many on the Democratic side were saying, this woke stuff, nobody cares, it's irrelevant, it doesn't cut through, it's all just right-wing hysteria. And I was sitting there in the middle going, no, it does cut through. It does cut through. If you're like a mum with kids in sport, in women's sport, in middle America, you absolutely care about this. And you want to have a candidate that can quite clearly tell you what a woman is. Now, again, I come back to this because to me it became a litmus test of where the left took things. If you can't articulate what a woman is without, as you say, I'm not... Look at me. I'm not remotely transphobic. I think trans people exist. They have a right to exist. They have a right to fairness, equality, safety, like you and me. I want the same rights for them that everybody else gets. However, not at the expense of eroding women's rights. And that's why the definition of a woman is so crucially important, because it stops the unfairness and inequality and safety issues that come from when you allow trans women to say we're women and they start trampling on women's rights. That's why it's so important.
Okay. I heard your statement. You articulated quite masterfully. I'm going to ask you if you allow me to respond without interruption. I'll take 20 seconds. There's a difference between saying we disagree on what defines a woman and saying that people who have a more expansive definition are struggling to define what a woman is. We're not struggling to define it. You just don't agree with us. Trans women are women. Cis women are women. They're all women. There are different experiences. There are different stories. There are different contexts. And we have to be, I think, honest about that in applying public policy. But there's no struggle here. If there's any struggle, it's been getting voters to remain focused on the issues that actually matter. I didn't have an issue that Kamala Harris prioritized or paid great attention to trans women's rights. The problem was she allowed the right wing to co-opt the narrative and make it seem like that's all she cared about, that she didn't care about workers' rights, that she didn't care about reparations, that she didn't care about living wages, that she didn't care about Palestinians in Gaza, that she didn't care about Haiti, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So no, that's not an issue. And finally, to take this one issue around women's sports, and which is relatively small in terms of its impact on everyday people, and make it seem as if trans people who make up an infinitesimal part of the American public are somehow running through your cities and just doing triple axels and dunks and swimming past all your little girls and ruining their sports dreams is a dishonest narrative. I probably agree with you to a large degree about needing to have a conversation about trans women in sports. I'm open to having that conversation. What I'm not open to doing is making it seem as if trans people are destroying the world, or they're destroying women's rights, or they're undermining women's rights. There's a lot of people undermining women's rights right now, and it ain't trans people. And allowing the right to convince us that that was the big issue in the election is why the Democrats lost. And I don't blame the Republicans for that. I blame the Democrats for not foregrounding the issues that mattered in addition to this other issue that also matters.
But Mark, I think you just made Piers's point.
Can a woman have
hang
on, Michael, I will come to you. But just quickly, can a woman have a penis, Mark? Yes or no?
These types, a trans woman may have a penis. A cis woman would not have a penis. These are silly gotcha games that are just used to get clips on the internet. I understand your point.
No, they're not.
You're saying
they're just simple biology. No, it's simple biology. A woman can't have a penis. Full stop.
You and I agree on the biology. The point here is that gender identities are different than sex identities. In other words, gender identity is not a biological construct. So yes, women birth babies. Men have penises. We all agree on that if we're talking about male and female, actually. Males have penises, women have vaginas. We agree with that. We can all agree on that. When we talk about gender, it's not purely about what you're assigned biologically at birth. And so to conflate the two things is to either be ignorant to the actual issue or to be disingenuous. I don't think that you are ignorant. I don't think you're disingenuous.
Is that a man?
Say that one more. Say that again. I didn't hear the question.
Oh, so just following that on the just the inverse also true then. So does anyone who has a vagina must be a man then, right?
No, that's not the inverse. That's not at all the inverse. The point here is that biologically, there's male and female. That's a much better question. That would follow more logically than the thing you initially asked. Biologically, if you have a vagina, if you're born with a vagina, you are a female. Biologically, if you're born with a penis, you are a male. Yes, that's not in dispute. What's in dispute is, are our biological, our identities at birth, are our biological identities the whole story? And in a trans conversation, we're saying, no, that's not the whole story. Yes, I was assigned male at birth. Everybody on this panel, ironically, was assigned male at birth. That's not in dispute. What's in dispute is, does that tell the whole story about our identity?
I wasn't assigned male at birth. Hang on.
We can also have.
But this whole language, Mark, this whole language is so ridiculous. I wasn't assigned male at birth. I was born a male. Right, and this is the problem. And when you talk about trans women in sport, the reason it's so important, the reason it's so important is there is a Mark. Let me just finish my point. I interviewed a woman called Betty Yee last week, who is literally a candidate to be governor of California, where I currently am. I have a home here in LA. And she genuinely wants the next Olympics in Los Angeles to be gender neutral. That's what she's endorsing, a gender-neutral Olympics, because she's been so traduced into going along with a lot of what you've just been saying, which trans women are women, therefore it shouldn't matter. You can merge the two sexes, you can have gender-neutral Olympics, and here's what happens when you do that. If you're at a gender-neutral Olympics, women wouldn't win any medals. End. You literally destroy women's sport irrevocably. Done. Gone. So once you assume that we separate the sexes at the Olympics, well, I don't think it's funny, this. I think it's so important. It's fundamental.
No, I don't think it's funny either. What I think is, I was laughing to myself because I was wondering.
Let me finish. We separate the sexes at the Olympics for a reason.
Please finish, but there's a 7-second delay, so I'm not interrupting you. There's just a 7-second delay. I'm telling that to the audience so that I don't look like I'm being rude to you. Go ahead.
I recognize that. You're not interrupting me. There is a very slight delay. I agree. Let me just ask you, though, why do we separate the sexes at the Olympics?
Okay, so I'm going to answer your question, but I'd like to respond to the first part of what you said, which I didn't get to respond to, because, again, you're making a straw man here. I'm not arguing for mixing the sexes at the Olympics. I agree with you that we start to divide sports by sex at around middle school, because there are some biological, physical differences between people born male and people born female that make it non-competitive for those assigned female or those who are identified as females at that point. So no, I understand why we divide people in track or basketball or wrestling. I'm not arguing for not doing that. I'm saying that two things can be true at once. As I said initially, we can have a conversation about trans people in sports, but that doesn't mean that I have to no longer identify trans men as men or trans women as women. We can say trans women are women and have conversations about sports that are different. And you're conflating those two. And every time I dispute your point about gender versus sex, you make a straw man argument about women competing in like the triathlon, which I'm not making.
All right, let me bring in Michael. You've been waiting very patiently here. But it seems to me, Michael, the left get themselves into torturous knots about this issue. They also fundamentally don't understand how it sounds to people listening to this stuff, because it sounds, honestly, it sounds slightly insane. Because what Mark has just done is articulated perfectly that we separate the sexes in the Olympics because men have a physical advantage, but at the same time he wants trans women to be actually acknowledged as actual women. Therefore, the argument should be they should be entitled to all the same rights as a woman. In other words, should be able to compete against women. This is the problem with it. Michael.
Yeah. I think that Mark has just proven the broader political point. Because to what Mark said, he said two things can be true at once. And that's true, but two opposing things cannot be true at once. That violates the law of non-contradiction, which we've known since at least Aristotle. So it cannot be the case. Mark's definition is that a woman is a person who identifies as a woman, but that's obviously a circular definition and therefore completely insufficient.
That's not what I said.
Or he'll say, hold on, let me just finish.
That's not what I said.
Or he'll say that
no, but that's not my position. I just want to be clear that that's not my position. You're stating is my position.
A woman can be biologically a woman, but for legal purposes, a man or something like that. And it's totally incoherent, and it obviously is not persuasive to voters. So getting back to the broader point that Piers opened up with, all he said was, look, if you asked AOC what a woman is, she would tie herself into knots answering. I think this panel, and Mark in particular, has just demonstrated that. And to your point, Brian, yes, I agree that Bernie is generally a non-woke leftist. And he's been very good, actually, on certain issues like immigration, because he's for reducing immigration to help workers' rights. However, I think Mamdani and AOC are manifestly woke, and I think you've just proven the point right here. If they cannot answer, as Ketanji Jackson, Supreme Court Justice, could not answer, what a woman is, that's a good rule of thumb. They've gone woke, and it has really hurt them with voters. It hurt them on common sense issues in 2024. And the more schizophrenia they demonstrate on issues like that, the worse they're going to do in 28.
I think.
Well, you can read more about this in my. Hang on, wait 1 second. You can.